In an age of empires and tyrants, when the cries of the oppressed rose like smoke into the heavens, destiny stirred in the heart of the desert. Beneath the scorching sun and beneath the stars of ancient prophecy, a man was chosen, not by kings nor by councils, but by the voice of the Eternal. His name was Moses. Born in the shadow of a throne and raised in the courts of Pharaoh, he walked between two worlds, prince and exile, warrior and shepherd. But it was not until the flame of the burning bush spoke his name that his true Odyssey began. With nothing but a staff in his hand and faith in the fire of the divine, he stood against the might of Egypt, shattered the chains of slavery, and led a people toward a promise carved into the very soul of creation. This is no ordinary journey. It is a passage through seas split by unseen hands, through wildernesses where heaven rained down bread, and through trials that tested the very heart of man. It is the story of a covenant older than time, of a leader burdened by glory, and of a people called not just to freedom, but to transformation. The sands remember his footsteps. The wind still echoes with the voice that thundered from the mountain. This is the Odyssey of Moses. This is the Exodus and the divine promise. Chapter 1. The Voice in the Flames. The world had grown silent as the night descended upon the land of Midian. The stars gleamed above, distant and eternal, watching over the earth below. In the shadow of the mountains, where the air was thick with the scent of the desert, a fire began to burn. It was no ordinary fire. There was something about it, a fire that burned without consuming the bush it engulfed. Something ancient, something powerful. Moses, a shepherd, had seen many things in his life, but never anything like this. His heart raced as he approached the flame, its heat somehow not touching his skin, its glow not blinding his eyes. Moses, Moses, a voice rang out, deep and commanding, yet filled with a tenderness that pierced his very soul. Frozen in place, Moses could barely breathe. The voice called him by name, yet there was no one there. His eyes widened with disbelief. Was he dreaming? Was this some trick of the desert wind? Moses, take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. His legs moved of their own accord. With trembling hands, he removed his sandals, the rough desert sand now against his bare feet. He fell to his knees, not out of fear, but out of reverence for something he could not understand, something that demanded his attention and respect. The voice continued, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries, and I have come down to deliver them. Moses' heart pounded in his chest. He was no prophet, no leader. He was just a man who had fled from Egypt, a man who had turned his back on his own people. Why had this voice chosen him? The voice spoke again with authority and resolve. I will send you to Pharaoh, and you will bring my people out of Egypt. Moses felt the weight of the words like a mountain upon his shoulders. He was being called to a destiny far greater than anything he had ever imagined. His doubts clouded his mind. He was not a man of power, not a man of great speech. How could he confront Pharaoh? How could he lead a people to freedom? But the voice would not be silenced. I will be with you, it promised. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship me on this mountain. Moses could no longer deny it. The fire before him was not a mere flame. It was a symbol of the divine power that had chosen him. He was standing at the precipice of a journey that would change the course of history. He stood, feeling a strange new strength coursing through him. He had been called, and he would answer. Chapter 2. The Reluctant Leader. Moses had walked many paths in his life, but none so fraught with destiny as the one now unfolding before him. The weight of the divine command hung heavily upon his heart, each step toward Egypt a heavy burden of fear and uncertainty. He was no great leader, no mighty warrior. He was a shepherd, a man who had once fled Egypt in shame, his identity torn from him in a moment of rashness. Now, decades later, he returned as a messenger of the heavens, sent to confront a power greater than himself, a force that had kept his people in bondage for generations. It was a task no one, least of all Moses, could have ever anticipated. The wilderness was a vast, unending stretch of sand and rock, the horizon blending seamlessly with the sky, as if the earth and heavens were one. Every step he took felt like an eternity, each footfall pulling him further away from the man he had been and closer to the man he was destined to become. A reluctant leader, unsure of his worth, and unprepared for the immense responsibility that lay ahead, Moses could not help but wonder how he had come to this point. What had he done to deserve this call? Why him? Why now? The quiet of the desert was broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the rocks, the rhythmic shuffle of his feet on the earth beneath, and the steady breathing of his brother, Aaron, walking beside him. Together, they moved through the wilderness, each step a journey not just through the desert, but through the deep well of history, the weight of centuries of oppression pressing upon them. Do you really believe that the Lord will give us the strength to confront Pharaoh? Aaron's voice broke through Moses' thoughts, quiet yet resolute, laced with the same uncertainty that Moses felt deep within his own chest. There was no anger in his brother's words, no bitterness, only a shared sense of fear and hope. Moses turned his gaze toward Aaron, seeing the same wariness reflected in his brother's eyes. The years of exile had not dimmed the sharpness of Aaron's intellect, nor the tenderness of his heart. Yet there was also something else in his gaze, a flicker of belief, a small but undeniable spark of hope. They had been chosen together for this moment, for this very purpose. It was a thought that filled Moses with both awe and dread. This wasn't just a task, it was a calling. I don't know, Moses replied, his voice wavering slightly. How can I believe it? I am nothing but a shepherd. I have failed before. I fled Egypt once because I thought I couldn't change anything. And now, the Lord calls me back to confront Pharaoh himself? How do we stand before him? Aaron, what can we possibly do to free our people? Aaron's hand rested briefly on Moses' shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. The Lord's hand is upon you, Moses. That's what matters. You're not going alone. He will guide you, just as he guided us here. Moses could not shake the feeling of inadequacy, nor the nagging doubt that haunted him every step of the way. Pharaoh was the most powerful ruler in the known world. His army was vast, his heart hard as stone. What hope did a simple shepherd have against such a force? How could Moses stand before the king of Egypt, a man whose power seemed as unshakable as the desert itself? The same Pharaoh who had ordered the killing of Hebrew children, who had driven Moses out of Egypt in fear and shame. Was he really ready to face him again? Yet, as the wind swept across the dunes, carrying with it the scent of the wilderness and the distant memory of Egypt's heavy chains, Moses felt the stirrings of a deeper understanding. The burning bush, the voice of God speaking from the fire, had called him for a reason. He had been chosen not for his strength, but for his willingness to trust, to step into the unknown despite his doubts. He was the man God had called to lead his people out of the shackles of slavery. Moses stopped walking and looked out over the horizon, where the desert stretched endlessly before them. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, and yet he could not ignore the pull in his heart, the overwhelming sense that this was where he was meant to be. There was no turning back. "We will go," Moses said, his voice steadying, the faintest trace of resolve beginning to take root in his chest. "And we will not go alone." Aaron's eyes shone with a quiet understanding, and he nodded, his faith in Moses unwavering. They had been brothers all their lives, and now, in this moment, they were bound by a greater purpose than either could fully comprehend. The weight of the divine task pressed upon them, but it was a weight they would bear together. As they continued their journey through the wilderness, the path seemed to stretch on endlessly. Yet with each step, Moses felt a flicker of something deep within him, something that spoke of divine strength, something that reminded him he was not merely a shepherd, but the chosen instrument of a higher will. The fire that had once consumed the bush now burned within him, urging him forward, driving him toward the confrontation with Pharaoh that loomed on the horizon. The stories of his people, their pain, their oppression, their cries for freedom, echoed in his heart. He could not ignore them. Not anymore. They had been enslaved for too long, their cries for deliverance reaching up to the heavens. And Moses, though reluctant and unsure, could not deny the call. He was the one who would lead them out, the one who would walk through fire and face the darkness for them. As the sun set on the barren desert, Moses felt the weight of his destiny settle upon him. He was no longer just a man who had fled Egypt in shame. He was Moses, the servant of the Most High, the man chosen to face Pharaoh and bring the people of Israel into the light of freedom. The journey had begun. Chapter 3. The confrontation with Pharaoh. The city of Pharaoh stood like a defiant monument to human pride, a fortress etched in stone against the shifting sands of time. Its walls rose like cliffs from the desert floor, each block carved with hieroglyphs celebrating conquest, divinity, and dominion. The golden sun blazed high above, reflecting off marble and obsidian domes, casting sharp shadows that danced across towering statues of jackal-headed gods and falcon-eyed kings. To all who beheld it, the city whispered the same truth. This is the seat of unchallenged power. Before the colossal gates stood Moses and Aaron, two lone figures dwarfed by the vastness of Egypt's might. Soldiers clad in bronze breastplates and crowned with serpent-shaped helms watched them with narrowed eyes, their spears upright like iron reeds. The scent of incense and the distant clang of temple bells filled the air. Egypt's gods were many, and their rituals never ceased. But Moses' mind was not on the guards, nor the gods of stone and gold. It was on the voice, the fire that had spoken from the bush on Mount Horeb, the voice that had carved thunder into his bones and carved purpose into his once hesitant heart. That voice had said, "I will be with you." And now, as they prepared to enter the very heart of tyranny, those words were the only armor he needed. They were led through marble corridors, past fountains shaped like lotus blossoms and murals of Pharaoh striking down enemies with divine fury. Slaves in white linen bowed low as the brothers passed, their eyes avoiding contact, but their souls stirred by something they could not name. Whispers followed Moses like a current. Is this the one, the Hebrew prince who vanished? At last, the great doors of the throne room groaned open. It was a chamber like none other, a cavern of power and opulence. Gold-veined columns rose into the vaulted heights, where painted stars adorned a sky-like ceiling. Incense curled like ghostly serpents through the air. And at the end of the long hall, seated upon a throne of ebony and gold, sat Pharaoh, the divine sovereign of Egypt, the son of Ra. His eyes were lined with kohl, his brow adorned with a crown shaped like a cobra ready to strike. He radiated authority, but his gaze was colder than the Nile in winter. He watched Moses and Aaron approach with the air of one who had seen men beg, kneel, and grovel, and fully expected to see it again. "Who dares to defy me?" Pharaoh's voice thundered across the hall, deep and resonant like a desert storm crashing against stone. "You come before the throne of Egypt with strange tongues and bolder claims. What power do you bring, shepherd of the wilderness?" Moses stepped forward, his staff in hand, every inch of his posture shaped by something greater than fear, something ancient, unshakable. "The Lord God of Israel has sent us to you," he said, his voice clear as the desert wind. "Let his people go, that they may serve him in the wilderness." A ripple of disbelief surged through the courtiers. Priests in leopard skin mantles murmured among themselves. Pharaoh raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a cruel smile. "Your God?" he said, scoffing. "What God is this who sends shepherds as envoys? I know not this Lord of yours. Egypt bows to no desert phantom. I am Pharaoh. I am Ra incarnate. I am the morning and the evening, the giver of life and the taker of breath. I bow to no one." A silence fell, thick and electric. But Moses did not flinch. "The God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob," Moses replied, "the maker of heaven and earth. He has heard the cry of his people, and he has sent me. You will let them go, or you will witness his wonders and wrath." Pharaoh leaned forward, his gaze sharp as obsidian. "Wonders," he hissed. "Then show me." Without a word, Moses lifted his staff high into the air. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a sudden flash of divine light, the staff writhed and twisted in his hands and became a living serpent. It fell to the marble floor with a hiss, coiling with supernatural strength, its scales glinting like burnished bronze, its eyes burning with an inner fire. Gasps erupted through the court. Even Pharaoh sat straighter, watching closely. But he did not falter. With a wave of his hand, he summoned his sorcerers and magicians. They came swiftly, cloaked in robes embroidered with stars and ancient sigils, their staffs adorned with sacred symbols. With practiced flair, they too cast their staffs upon the ground, and with spells and chants, their rods turned to serpents, slithering forward, hissing in defiance. But then came the moment. Before the watching eyes of Pharaoh's court, Moses' serpent struck. With divine swiftness, it lunged and devoured the others whole, swallowing them as the flame devours chaff. The magicians stepped back, stunned. A murmur of unease rippled through the chamber. Pharaoh's face darkened like a gathering storm. Rage flickered behind his eyes, but so too did something else, fear, just for a heartbeat. Yet he masked it quickly. Tricks, he growled. Sorcery, nothing more. He stood from his throne, robes flowing like storm clouds behind him. You dare threaten me in my own house? You come here with illusions and demand my slaves? Begone, Hebrew. Egypt bows to no desert god. But Moses knew the truth now. The war had begun, not of armies, but of wills. Not of swords, but of signs and wonders. Pharaoh's heart had turned to stone, but the Lord's fire would melt even the hardest rock. Moses turned, his face resolute, and Aaron followed. They walked out of the palace not in defeat, but in the calm before the tempest. The confrontation was not the end. It was only the first strike of a heavenly war drum echoing across Egypt. Outside the gates, the air seemed to shift. The sky grew slightly dim. The wind whispered through the palms. Something ancient stirred in the earth. The battle for freedom had begun. Chapter 4. The Plagues Unleashed. Pharaoh's heart, once merely stubborn, had now become as stone, immovable, unfeeling, deaf to the cries of a nation bound in chains. The miracles Moses had shown, the serpent that devoured all challengers, had shaken the court, but not its king. Pride, ancient and vast as the pyramids, stood guard around Pharaoh's soul. He would not bend. He would not yield. But heaven had heard the suffering of the Hebrews. And now, heaven would answer, not with whispers, but with a roar. The sky darkened as the first sign of divine judgment arrived. The Nile, that sacred artery of Egypt, revered as a god in its own right, turned foul and red, a river of blood. Fish floated lifeless upon its surface. Crops wilted at its banks. The people ran to their wells and jars, but even their stored water was tainted. Panic gripped the nation, and priests trembled at the desecration of their holiest stream. Still, Pharaoh stood unmoved, his gaze locked with Moses, filled with fury, not fear. The second plague rose from the mud and the mist, frogs, countless and ceaseless. They poured from the Nile, from ponds, from the very soil. Into homes they leapt, into ovens and beds, into the thrones of nobles and the huts of slaves. The croaking chorus became a nightmare lullaby, a green tide that overran the land. Pharaoh called for Moses and begged for relief. Pray to your God to take them away. But when the frogs vanished at Moses' command, Pharaoh's heart once more turned cold. So came the third plague, a cloud of dust from which arose lice, tiny and biting, invading hair, clothing, and flesh. No magic of Egypt could stop them. Even Pharaoh's sorcerers fell to their knees, whispering, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh, proud Pharaoh, clenched his fists and denied the divine. Then the air changed, and the fourth plague descended in a terrible swarm. Flies, black and buzzing, filled every chamber, every corridor, every breath of wind. The rich and poor alike found no refuge. Sacred temples were defiled, idols lost beneath a writhing mass of wings. And yet, Not a single fly touched the land of Goshen, where the Israelites dwelt. A separation had begun between those under judgment and those under divine protection. Still, Pharaoh refused. Then came death to the beasts of the field. Horses, camels, oxen, and sheep, the pride of Egypt's wealth, fell where they stood. The air reeked of decay, and the cries of farmers rose to the heavens. Yet again, the livestock of Israel remained untouched. Next, boils broke out upon the skin of every Egyptian, burning, festering sores that covered nobles and slaves alike. Physicians could not soothe them. Even the magicians could not stand before Pharaoh, for they too were afflicted. And through it all, Moses stood before Egypt's throne, calm and steadfast, his words echoing with divine power. "Let my people go." But Pharaoh's heart, like iron forged in defiance, would not bend. Then the skies unleashed their fury. The seventh plague came in thunder and lightning, a tempest never before seen in the land. Hailstones rained down like divine artillery, crushing trees, shattering stone, setting fields ablaze with fire from heaven. Egypt's gods of sky and storm were silent. The people screamed, and Pharaoh cried out once more to Moses, "I have sinned. Entreat your God." But when the hail ceased, his repentance evaporated. Still, the plagues marched on. The eighth was a living tide, locusts. They came in a black cloud that blotted out the sun, devouring everything in their path. Whatever had survived the hail, the locusts consumed. Fields, orchards, and vineyards were left as barren as the desert. Hope fled from the hearts of the Egyptians, but Pharaoh's pride clung to its throne. Then came a darkness deeper than night, the ninth plague. For 3 days, a shadow fell over Egypt, thick and choking, a darkness that could be felt. Torches gave no light. People groped blindly, unable to move, trapped in a realm without dawn. But in Goshen there was light. Even the sun obeyed the will of the Lord. Yet Pharaoh, blind in spirit as his people were in flesh, still refused. His arrogance had become his prison. Moses and Aaron returned once more to the court, now dim and fearful. The servants of Pharaoh flinched at their approach. The air around them was heavy with dread, for something final, something terrible, now loomed. "This is the last sign," Moses said, his voice low and thunderous. "Thus says the Lord, at midnight I will go through the land of Egypt. Every firstborn shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the maidservant behind the mill, and even the firstborn of the beasts. Then you shall know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." Pharaoh's mask cracked. Behind his eyes there was something new, not rage, not defiance, but the flicker of dread. Yet even now he would not yield. He dismissed Moses with a hiss, barking, "Never come before me again. If I see your face, you shall die." Moses turned without fear. "You have spoken truly," he said. "I shall not see your face again." The fate of Egypt had been sealed. The final blow was coming, swift, silent, and divine. And as the sun set on that cursed day, a shadow passed over Egypt, long and cold, the shadow of death yet to come. Chapter 5. The Passover and the Final Plague. Night fell upon Egypt with an eerie stillness, unlike any that had come before. It was not merely the absence of light, but a suffocating presence that cloaked the land in dread. The wind ceased. The stars hid their faces. The entire kingdom, from the highest palace to the humblest hut, seemed to hold its breath in anxious anticipation. Something ancient, something divine, was moving in the unseen. In the homes of the Israelites, the air was thick with solemn preparation. They moved with reverence, following Moses' every instruction with sacred precision. Each household took a lamb without blemish, slaughtered it at twilight, and smeared its blood upon the doorposts and lintels of their homes, a divine mark, a sign to the heavens. Inside, they roasted the lamb, ate it with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, dressed and ready to depart, staff in hand, sandals on their feet. It was a meal not of celebration, but of deliverance, a ritual wrapped in mystery and hope. For the Lord had spoken through Moses. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague shall touch you when I strike Egypt. Midnight approached, and with it came a dreadful silence that blanketed the land. Then, without warning, a presence swept across Egypt, silent as a shadow, swift as judgment. It was the angel of death, moving unseen, unstoppable. Where there was no blood upon the door, he entered, and from each of those homes he took. A terrible cry broke the silence. It began as a single wail, sharp, anguished, then multiplied, rising like a wave crashing through the city. In every household, from the lowest servant to the royal palace, the firstborn fell. Sons died in their sleep. Infants slipped away in their mother's arms. Even the animals groaned in death. The entire land was pierced by a cry of mourning, a sound of grief so vast that it seemed the earth itself wept. In Pharaoh's palace, the blow was most devastating. His son, his legacy, lay lifeless in silken sheets. No priest, no spell, no god of Egypt had saved him. Pharaoh, the man who was called a god, was now just a father broken by sorrow. He rose from his throne not in power, but in pain. He sent for Moses and Aaron in the dead of night. There was no ceremony now, no guards, no pride. Pharaoh stood before the two brothers like a shadow of the man he had been. His voice trembled, a mixture of rage, grief, and surrender. "Go," he whispered, and the weight of the word echoed through the halls. "Take your people, take your flocks, your herds, everything you have, and leave. Leave Egypt, and bless me also, if your God will hear you." Moses met Pharaoh's gaze with calm authority. There was no gloating, no triumph. Only awe, for the power of the Almighty had been revealed in full, and it had shaken the very heart of the kingdom. Outside, the Israelites gathered in haste. Word had spread like fire. They were free, free after generations of bondage, free by the hand of the God of their fathers. But there was no time to waste. The people baked their unleavened bread, packed their belongings, and took what they could carry. And as the Lord had said, they asked the Egyptians for silver, gold, and fine clothing. And the Egyptians, struck with fear and desperate to be rid of them, gave freely. So the slaves became a people burdened not with chains, but with the wealth of the nation that had oppressed them. The stars returned to the sky as the people began to move. There was no turning back. The Lord himself led them, guiding their steps into the wilderness. Behind them lay a land struck by divine judgment. Before them stretched a path unknown, but it was the path of promise, of destiny. That night became eternal. It was not merely a night of escape. It was the night of covenant. The Passover was born, a sacred remembrance that would be kept by every generation. A night when God did not only pass over homes, but stepped into history to claim a people as his own. A night of terror, yes, but also of mercy, when the blood of a lamb spared the lives of many. It was the prelude to deliverance, the door through which freedom entered. And thus, Israel walked away from the land of its captivity, not as fugitives, but as the chosen, carrying with them the promise of God and the memory of a night when death came, but passed them by. Chapter 6, The Red Sea. The Israelites, freshly freed from the chains of slavery, walked through the wilderness with hearts full of both hope and uncertainty. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unknown. They had escaped Egypt's grasp, but the journey ahead was full of both promise and danger. They were no longer slaves. They were free, but freedom always comes with challenges. Pharaoh, his pride shattered by the loss of his people, could not accept defeat. The sight of his mighty army humbled by a people he once owned was unbearable. His rage consumed him, and he rallied his chariots and soldiers to chase down the Israelites. The thunder of his army's hooves filled the air, signaling that Pharaoh's fury was far from finished. Determined to reclaim his property, he set off in pursuit of the fleeing Israelites. The Israelites, marching through the wilderness, were unaware of the growing danger behind them. The desert was harsh, and their resources were running low, but they pressed forward with faith. As they neared the Red Sea, its waters glimmered in the distance, both a promise and a looming threat. It was here, at the edge of the sea, that they realized they were trapped. Behind them, Pharaoh's army was closing in, and before them, the sea stretched out endlessly. The sound of the chariots and war cries grew louder as the Israelites turned to face the oncoming danger. Fear seized their hearts, for there was nowhere to run. Moses, unwavering in his faith, stood before the people and raised his staff to the heavens. His voice echoed with the authority of God as he declared, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance of the Lord. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." With those words, the winds began to stir. The sea that had seemed so impossible to cross now parted, its waters rising like towering walls on both sides. A dry path appeared through the heart of the Red Sea, and the Israelites, with awe and wonder, began to cross. As they moved forward, Pharaoh's army followed, believing they could reclaim the Israelites. But as the last of the Israelites reached safety on the far shore, Moses raised his staff again. The waters that had parted so miraculously now surged back, crashing down on Pharaoh's army. The sound of the waves was deafening as the soldiers and chariots were swallowed by the sea. The Israelites, looking back, saw only calm waters, and Pharaoh's army was no more. The Lord had delivered them. They were free, free from Egypt's oppression, free from the fear that had once gripped their hearts. The Red Sea, once an obstacle, had become the symbol of their salvation. The Lord's power had shown them the way, and they knew they would never walk alone again. The Israelites, now standing on the far side of the Red Sea, knew that their journey was far from over, but the mighty deliverance they had just witnessed would remain a reminder of God's power and his promise to lead them to the land he had promised. Chapter 7. The Wilderness Journey. For days, the Israelites wandered through the vast wilderness, their steps leaving faint traces on the barren desert sands. The land stretched endlessly, arid and desolate, with nothing but dry earth and scorching sun in every direction. The heat was suffocating, and the thirst that gripped them was unbearable. Their faces were weathered from the sun, their lips cracked and dry, their bodies weakened by the unrelenting conditions. Yet they carried with them a promise from the Almighty, that they would reach the land flowing with milk and honey, the land their ancestors had once called home. It was a promise that burned brightly in their hearts, even as the wilderness threatened to dim their hope. But the journey proved far more difficult than they had imagined. Days turned into weeks, and the harshness of the desert wore on them. The once joyful people, freed from the chains of slavery, now found themselves questioning the cost of their freedom. Their faith, which had once burned brightly like the sun above, began to flicker. The barren wasteland stretched endlessly before them, and the hunger and thirst they endured became a constant, gnawing reminder of the harsh reality they faced. It was in these moments of despair that the people began to grumble, their complaints rising like the dust beneath their feet. "Why did you bring us out here to die?" they cried out to Moses. "We had food in Egypt, even if it was as slaves. Now we are starving, with nothing but this barren desert before us." Moses' heart was heavy with their words, for he too felt the weight of the journey pressing down on him. He knew the promise of the Lord, but the road ahead was long, and the people's faith was faltering. They had seen the mighty works of God, the plagues that had struck Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea. Yet in their desperation, it was as if they had forgotten the power of the Lord who had brought them this far. But Moses did not falter. He trusted in the promise of the Lord, even when it seemed impossible. And the Lord did not disappoint. The very next morning, when the Israelites awoke, they found the ground covered in a strange, fine, bread-like substance. It was manna, a gift from heaven, sent by God to sustain them in their time of need. Moses, seeing the wonder in their eyes, instructed the people, "Gather what you need for today, for the Lord has provided." Each morning, the manna fell from the heavens, and each evening the people were filled. It was a daily reminder of God's faithfulness, a provision that never failed, even when the wilderness seemed endless. The Israelites, though weary and often complaining, began to understand that God's promises were not just distant dreams. They were present, unfolding before their eyes. But the trials were far from over. The desert, with its harsh heat and endless expanse, still held many challenges. The Israelites, though nourished by the manna, found themselves thirsting once again. The dryness of the land seemed to mock their plight, and their thirst became unbearable. Once again, they turned their complaints to Moses. "Why did you bring us out here to die of thirst?" they cried. "Was there not enough water in Egypt, even in our slavery?" Moses, knowing that they were lost in their despair, turned to the Lord for help. And once again, the Lord answered. He spoke to Moses, instructing him to strike a rock with his staff. Moses, obeying the command, struck the rock, and to the amazement of the Israelites, water poured forth from the stone, flowing in a great stream to quench their thirst. The people drank deeply, their thirst quenched by the miraculous provision of the Lord. It was a sign to them, a reminder that though the journey was difficult, they were never alone. With each trial, God proved himself faithful, showing his people that they could trust in his provision. The journey through the wilderness was long, and the people often grew weary, but with every challenge, they were reminded that the Lord was with them. The pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day guided them, giving them direction and comfort as they traveled through the barren land. The covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was being fulfilled before their very eyes, and though the road was hard, they were walking in the steps of their ancestors toward the land of promise. With each passing day, the Israelites grew stronger in their faith, learning that the Lord would not abandon them. The wilderness, though a place of trial, became a place of transformation. They were not the same people who had left Egypt. They were being shaped and tested, prepared for the land that would one day be theirs. In this harsh desert, the Israelites found more than just survival. They found the presence of the Lord, guiding, providing, and reminding them of the covenant that had been made long ago. And though their journey was far from over, they now knew that they were no longer alone. God had promised them a land of abundance, and his faithfulness would carry them through the wilderness, step by step, until they reached it. Chapter 8. The Covenant at Sinai. After a long and arduous journey through the wilderness, the Israelites finally arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. The land around them was vast, the mountains towering high into the sky, casting their shadows upon the people below. There is a sense of reverence in the air, a quiet anticipation that hung over the camp as the Israelites waited, knowing that something momentous was about to unfold. Moses, the chosen leader, knew that it was time to ascend the mountain and meet with the Lord. He had been the mediator between God and the people, the one who had led them out of Egypt, and now he would climb the mountain to receive the very laws that would govern their lives. As he began his ascent, the people watched in awe, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. What would the Lord require of them? What was this new covenant that was about to be established? At the summit of Mount Sinai, Moses was enveloped by a thick cloud, a visible manifestation of God's presence. The cloud was dark and swirling, a divine mystery that seemed to radiate with the power of the Almighty. The very mountain trembled beneath Moses' feet, and the air was thick with the weight of God's glory. The people below stood in silence, gazing up at the towering peak as a deep, thunderous voice echoed from the cloud, filling the heavens and the earth. The Lord spoke to Moses, and his voice reverberated through the air like thunder, declaring the laws that would define the covenant between himself and the Israelites. These were not mere rules, but the foundation of a new way of life, a divine blueprint for the society that was to come. "You shall have no other gods before me," the voice thundered, its command clear and absolute. "You shall not make for yourselves a graven image. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal." These were the 10 Commandments, a divine revelation that would form the very core of the Israelites' faith and their identity as a chosen people. They were not just laws, but a reflection of God's holiness, a reminder that the people were to live in a way that honored his righteousness. The Ten Commandments would serve as the foundation of their society, guiding them in every aspect of their lives, from their relationship with God to their treatment of one another. As Moses stood on the mountain, listening to the voice of God, he was filled with awe and fear. These laws were not just for the people, they were for him as well. He understood that the covenant was a sacred agreement, one that bound the Israelites to the Lord and the Lord to them. It was a covenant of love and obedience, a call to holiness that would set them apart from the nations around them. When Moses descended from the mountain, he carried the stone tablets that contained the Ten Commandments, the written laws that would guide the people's lives. The Israelites waited eagerly to hear what the Lord had spoken, their hearts filled with anticipation. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the establishment of their covenant with God. Moses shared the commandments with the people, explaining the weight of the promises that had been made and the responsibilities they now carried. The people, awed by the solemnity of the moment, pledged their allegiance to the Lord and his laws. They would be his people, and he would be their God. The covenant was sealed, and the Israelites knew that from this day forward, they were to live according to the commandments that had been given to them on the mountain. In that moment, the people of Israel stood on the threshold of a new beginning. The wilderness journey had been hard, and their faith had been tested, but now they were entering into a new chapter of their existence. They were no longer a scattered people wandering in a foreign land. They were a nation bound together by covenant with God, and the laws given at Sinai would be the foundation of their identity. The covenant at Sinai was not just a historical event. It was the beginning of a relationship between God and his people that would last for generations. It was a promise of protection, guidance, and blessings, but it was also a call to responsibility. The people were to live according to God's will, and in return, they would experience his favor and the fulfillment of his promises. As Moses and the Israelites stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, they knew that they were entering a new era. The covenant had been established, and now it was up to them to live according to the laws of God. The journey ahead would not be easy, but they had the guidance of the Lord, and with his help, they would fulfill the purpose for which they had been chosen. And so, the Israelites stood together, united under the covenant, ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. The Ten Commandments were more than just laws. They were the heartbeat of a nation, the divine principles that would shape their lives and their destiny. The Lord had spoken, and his words would guide them through the wilderness and into the promised land. Chapter 9. The Golden Calf. After the Israelites had received the commandments from the Lord, Moses ascended once more to Mount Sinai to commune with God. The people, still filled with awe from the profound encounter with the divine, had been left in the camp, waiting for Moses' return. However, as days stretched into weeks, a sense of impatience and uncertainty began to take hold. The mountain loomed high in the distance, a reminder of the greatness of God. Yet Moses' absence left the people restless. "Where is this Moses?" they murmured among themselves, their voices tinged with doubt and frustration. "What has become of him? Has he abandoned us?" The uncertainty of their journey, coupled with the long wait, unraveled their faith. They had been promised a land flowing with milk and honey, but now, in the midst of the wilderness, the weight of their doubts and fears began to show. Without their leader, they were unsure of their path, and the isolation they felt from God began to grow heavier. In their desperation, they turned to Aaron, Moses' brother, asking him to take Moses' place. "Make us gods who will go before us," they demanded. "As for this Moses, we do not know what has happened to him." Aaron, torn between his faith in God and the pressure from the people, hesitated but ultimately gave in to their demands. He gathered the gold jewelry from the people and melted it down, crafting a golden calf, an idol for the people to worship. It was a clear violation of the commandments they had just received, but in their fear and uncertainty, the people sought something tangible, something they could touch and see. When the golden calf was finished, the people rejoiced. They danced around it in a frenzy, their hearts turned toward idolatry. They sang songs of praise to this false god, their minds far removed from the promises of the Lord who had delivered them from Egypt. They had forgotten the God who had parted the Red Sea and led them through the wilderness with fire by night and a cloud by day. They had forgotten the covenant they had made with him. Meanwhile, Moses was still on the mountain, receiving further instructions from the Lord. He had no idea what was unfolding below. But as he descended from the mountain, carrying the stone tablets inscribed with God's commandments, the sight before him struck him to his core. The camp was filled with chaos, and the people were caught up in a wild celebration around the golden calf. Their behavior was reckless, filled with sin and debauchery, and Moses' heart burned with righteous anger. Without hesitation, Moses hurled the stone tablets to the ground, breaking them in the midst of their idolatry. The sacred laws of God were shattered, symbolizing the brokenness of the covenant between the people and the Lord. The sound of Moses' fury echoed through the camp as he confronted the people's sin. "Moses, why do you anger the Lord?" Moses cried out, his voice filled with sorrow and frustration. "You have turned away from him, and in doing so, you have defiled yourselves." Aaron, trembling and ashamed, stood before Moses, unable to defend his actions. His guilt weighed heavily on him as he pleaded for mercy. "Do not be angry with me, my Lord," he said, his voice shaking. "The people were so intent on evil, I could not stop them. They demanded a God to lead them, and I did what they asked." Moses' fury was just, and his heart was grieved for the people. He had witnessed the miracles of God, the power that had brought them out of slavery, yet now they had turned to worship a lifeless idol. His anger was not just about the disobedience. It was a reflection of the broken relationship between the people and the Lord. Moses, in his righteous indignation, called for those who remained faithful to the Lord, those who had not been swept away by the tide of idolatry. The Levites, a tribe dedicated to serving God, responded to Moses' call. Their hearts were pure, their devotion to the Lord unshaken. They rallied to Moses' side, determined to restore order and purity to the camp. Moses instructed the Levites to purify the camp, to rid it of the defilement of the golden calf. The idolaters were swiftly judged, and many were struck down for their sin. The actions of the Levites served as a solemn reminder of the seriousness of disobedience and the consequences of turning away from God. Through the swift judgment, the people were forced to confront the depth of their rebellion. The covenant had been broken, but God's mercy was not absent. Moses interceded on behalf of the people, pleading with the Lord to forgive their sin. He climbed once more to the mountain, carrying the broken tablets, asking God to renew the covenant with his people. The Israelites' fall into idolatry was a powerful lesson in the fragility of faith. Their journey was not just one of physical hardship, but a test of their trust in the Lord. Yet, even in the midst of their sin, God's mercy was still available. The path to redemption would require repentance and obedience, but the Lord, in his grace, would provide the way forward. Chapter 10. The New Tablets and the Renewal of the Covenant. After the crisis of the golden calf, the Israelites found themselves at a crossroads, their relationship with God deeply fractured by their sin. The weight of their disobedience hung heavily upon them. Moses, deeply grieved by the people's actions, returned to the mountaintop, determined to seek forgiveness for their great sin. The weight of his mission was immense. Not only did he bear the guilt of the people, but he also sought a way to restore the covenant that had been broken by their idolatry. In the solitude of the mountaintop, Moses cried out to the Lord, pleading on behalf of the Israelites. "Lord, these people are your children," Moses said, his voice filled with both sorrow and hope. "Forgive them, and remember your promise to their ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do not let their sin bring an end to your covenant with us." The Lord, in his boundless mercy, listened to Moses' plea. He understood the hearts of the people, and though they had sinned greatly, he was not quick to abandon them. In his infinite grace, God instructed Moses to carve 2 new tablets of stone, for the first set had been shattered in Moses' righteous anger upon seeing the people's idolatry. This was a sign of hope, that despite their sin, the Lord was still willing to renew the relationship. Moses, obedient to the Lord's command, carefully carved the new tablets and made his way once again to the summit of Mount Sinai. The climb was arduous, but Moses was resolute, for he knew that his actions would determine the future of the people. As he ascended, he was filled with a sense of anticipation. What would the Lord say this time? At the summit, the Lord spoke once more to Moses, his presence enveloping the mountain in a cloud of glory. "You shall be my people, and I will be your God," the Lord declared, reaffirming the covenant he had made with the Israelites. "If you follow my ways and keep my commandments, I will bless you and bring you into the land I have promised to your fathers." These words were not just a promise, they were an invitation. The Lord was extending his grace, offering the people another chance to live according to his commands, to walk in his ways, and to be a light to the nations. It was a powerful reminder that despite their failures, God's love and faithfulness remained unshaken. With the new tablets in his hands, Moses descended from the mountain, his heart filled with a renewed sense of purpose. But as he made his way down, something remarkable had occurred. His face shone with the glory of the Lord. The radiance that emanated from him was so intense that the people were afraid to come near him. The transformation was unmistakable. Moses had been in the presence of God, and the effect was evident for all to see. When Moses spoke to the people, they were in awe of the man before them. His face, glowing with the light of God's presence, was a visible testament to the renewal of the covenant. He was no longer the same man who had left the camp weeks ago. He was now marked by the divine, a living witness to the power and mercy of the Lord. Moses, seeing their fear, covered his face with a veil, but the radiance did not fade. It remained, a constant reminder of the Lord's mercy and the sacred nature of the covenant that had been renewed. The people listened attentively as Moses spoke to them, conveying the laws and the commandments that the Lord had given him once again. This time, the people knew that the stakes were higher. They had been given another opportunity to honor their covenant with God, and they were determined to obey. The renewal of the covenant was a turning point for the Israelites. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in their journey, one where their relationship with the Lord would be defined not just by their obedience, but by their willingness to trust in his mercy and grace. And for Moses, it was a moment of personal transformation as well. He was no longer just a servant of God. He was a messenger of his divine will, his life forever marked by the glory of the Lord. The new tablets were a symbol of hope, of restoration, and of the enduring faithfulness of God. The people's journey was far from over, but they now had a renewed sense of purpose and a clear path forward. They were reminded that even in their darkest moments, God was. Chapter 11. The Tabernacle. After the renewal of the covenant, the Lord gave Moses a divine command to build a tabernacle, a sacred and portable sanctuary where his presence would dwell among his people. This was not just any structure. It was to be a holy place set apart for the worship of the Almighty. The tabernacle would serve as the focal point of Israel's worship, where the people could come to encounter the living God, and it would guide them through the wilderness, becoming a symbol of God's covenant and faithfulness. The Lord's instructions were detailed and precise, laying out everything from the materials to the measurements. Every aspect of the tabernacle was designed to reflect the holiness of God and to provide a space for his glory to rest. The people were instructed to bring offerings of the finest materials: gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, acacia wood, and precious stones, so that they could build a dwelling place worthy of the Lord's presence. The Israelites, eager to follow God's command, worked together in unity, each contributing according to their ability. Skilled craftsmen and artisans labored to fashion the sacred furnishings, including the altar, the table of showbread, the golden lampstand, and the Ark of the Covenant, which would hold the tablets of the law. The work was meticulous, with every detail designed to honor the holiness of the Lord and to create a space where God could be worshipped in reverence and awe. As the construction of the tabernacle progressed, the people's excitement grew. They understood the significance of what they were building. This was not just a tent. It was the very place where the presence of God would dwell among them. The project became a labor of love and devotion, as each individual knew that they were contributing to something far greater than themselves. Finally, after weeks of hard work, the tabernacle was completed. The moment had arrived. Moses carefully oversaw the final touches, and when everything was in place, the time came for God's presence to fill the tabernacle. As Moses consecrated the sanctuary, the glory of the Lord descended upon it in a visible form, a cloud of glory that filled the tabernacle, a tangible sign of the divine presence. The cloud was a symbol of God's holiness and his desire to be with his people, dwelling in their midst as their protector and guide. When the cloud of the Lord's glory rested upon the tabernacle, the people knew that God was with them. It became a constant reminder that the Lord had not abandoned them, even in the midst of their journey through the wilderness. The cloud would guide them each day, and its movements dictated their actions. Whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, it was a sign that it was time to move on. The Israelites would pack up their belongings and follow, trusting that the Lord was leading them to the next stage of their journey. But when the cloud remained over the tabernacle, the people knew that they were to stay put, to wait for God's next command. The presence of the cloud was both a comfort and a challenge, a reminder that God was ever present, guiding them, but also a call to obedience and trust. They were to follow the cloud wherever it led, even in the unknown and uncertain wilderness, knowing that the Lord would never leave them or forsake them. The tabernacle became the heart of the Israelite camp, the center of their worship, and the place where they could draw near to the Lord. It was a symbol of God's faithfulness to his covenant and his desire to dwell among his people. And for Moses, it was a tangible sign that his leadership was blessed by God's presence, a powerful reminder that God had not abandoned his people, despite their failures and shortcomings. As the Israelites continued their journey through the wilderness, the tabernacle would remain with them, a constant source of guidance, protection, and strength. The cloud of the Lord's glory would guide their every step, leading them toward the land of promise, the land flowing with milk and honey, a land where they would one day build a permanent temple to house the presence of God forever. Until then, the tabernacle would be their sacred home, a place where they could experience the nearness of God and the fulfillment of his covenant promises. Chapter 12. The Journey to the Promised Land. The Israelites had been journeying through the wilderness for many years now, each day guided by the cloud of God's glory and sustained by his miraculous provisions. But despite the many wonders they had witnessed, the road to the Promised Land remained long and difficult. The people's hearts, once filled with hope and gratitude, began to grow weary. They had become discontented, their complaints rising once again as they faced the challenges of the harsh desert. It began with a lack of food. The Israelites' hearts longed for the variety and abundance they had once known in Egypt, even as slaves. They murmured against Moses and Aaron, saying, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Their complaints echoed through the camp, and their faith in God began to falter once again. But the Lord, in his infinite mercy, responded to their needs. He sent quail into the camp, filling the air with their presence, and the people gathered them up, having meat to eat. As they ate, the Lord also provided manna from heaven, the bread of life, which sustained them each day. Yet, despite these abundant blessings, the people's hearts remained restless, and their complaints continued to rise. Their grumbling was not just against Moses. It was a rejection of the Lord's faithfulness. The next trial came when the Israelites reached the border of the Promised Land. They were so close to the land that had been promised to their ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. To prepare for their entry, Moses sent 12 men, one from each tribe, to scout the land and report back on what they found. The spies journeyed into the land, exploring its cities, its crops, and its people. When they returned, they brought back an abundance of fruit as proof of the land's fertility. But the report they delivered was filled with fear and uncertainty. "Truly, the land flows with milk and honey," they said. "But the people who dwell on the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And we saw the descendants of Anak there, giants among men. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Fear and doubt gripped the hearts of the people as they heard the report, and the confidence they had once had began to crumble. Yet, among the 12 spies, there were 2 men who stood firm in their faith, Caleb and Joshua. They spoke up, declaring, "The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But the people refused to listen to Caleb and Joshua. Instead, they were overwhelmed by fear, and they listened to the 10 spies who had spread discouragement and doubt. In their rebellion, they cried out against Moses and Aaron, wishing they had died in Egypt or in the wilderness rather than face the giants of the Promised Land. They began to speak of choosing a new leader, one who would lead them back to Egypt. Their hearts of unbelief and rebellion angered the Lord, and he declared that this generation, the generation that had doubted his power and his promises, would not enter the land of promise. They had seen his mighty works, but they had failed to trust him. Because of their lack of faith, they would wander in the wilderness for 40 years until every member of this disobedient generation had passed away. Only their children, the next generation, would enter the land that was promised to their forefathers. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people reject me? How long will they not believe in me, with all the signs which I have performed among them?" But despite their failure, God remained faithful. He promised that their children would inherit the land, and that they would conquer the giants and fortified cities that had caused their parents to fear. Thus, the Israelites faced a long and painful journey ahead. They would wander for 40 years in the wilderness, a journey of testing and discipline, but also one of preparation. They would learn to trust in the Lord with all their hearts, to obey his commands, and to believe in his power. The land of promise awaited them, but it would be the new generation, those who had not been tainted by doubt, who would enter and claim the victory. As they continued their journey, the memory of their rebellion would remain, but it would serve as a powerful lesson for the future, a reminder that faith in the Lord is the key to victory, and that with him, no obstacle is too great to overcome. Chapter 13, The Death of Moses. The years had passed, and Moses had faithfully led the Israelites through their trials in the wilderness, guiding them with wisdom, strength, and unwavering trust in God. Yet, as the journey drew closer to its end, Moses knew that his time was near. The Lord had told him that he would not enter the promised land, the land he had promised to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The weight of this knowledge settled upon Moses' heart, for though he had seen the fulfillment of many promises, this final one would remain just out of his reach. In the quiet solitude of Mount Nebo, the Lord spoke to Moses, showing him the land that he had labored so long to lead his people toward. From the summit of the mountain, Moses stood alone, his eyes tracing the contours of the land that flowed with milk and honey, the land rich with promise. He saw the fertile valleys, the lush fields, and the towering cities that awaited the Israelites. His heart ached with the knowledge that he would never step foot in that land himself. But Moses was not bitter. Instead, he stood there in quiet awe, knowing that the Lord had been faithful to bring his people this far, and that his promises would be fulfilled, even if Moses would not live to see it. The land that had been promised to Abraham and his descendants would now be given to the next generation. Though Moses' journey would end here, the legacy of his faithfulness would live on in the hearts of the people. At the end of this solemn moment, Moses died on Mount Nebo. The scriptures tell us that he died there, in the land of Moab, but that the Lord himself buried him in a place known only to God. The exact location of Moses' burial site remains a mystery, a testament to the sacredness of this moment and the honor of the man who had been chosen to lead Israel. Moses' death marked the end of an era for the Israelites. He had been their leader, their prophet, and their intercessor before the Lord. He had been the one to bring the 10 Commandments to the people, the one to speak face to face with God, the one who had led them out of slavery and through the wilderness. His leadership had shaped the very identity of the nation, and now, with his passing, it was time for a new leader to rise. Joshua, Moses' faithful servant and trusted lieutenant, was chosen by God to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land. The mantle of leadership passed to Joshua, and though the people mourned the loss of Moses, they knew that they would continue the journey under God's guidance. Joshua would lead them with the same courage and strength that Moses had shown, trusting in God's promises and stepping forward in faith. And so, the legacy of Moses lived on in the generations that followed. His life, marked by faith, humility, and unwavering devotion to God, would inspire not only the people of Israel, but all who would hear the story of his life. The Promised Land awaited, and though Moses would not enter it, his role in the fulfillment of God's plan was secure. The journey he had started would continue, and the covenant God had made with his people would be fulfilled through those who followed in his footsteps. Chapter 14. The Leadership of Joshua. With Moses passing, the mantle of leadership fell to Joshua, the faithful servant who had stood beside Moses through every trial, every challenge, and every triumph. Joshua had been Moses' right hand, witnessing firsthand the power of God as he led the Israelites out of Egypt, through the wilderness, and toward the Promised Land. Now, it was Joshua's turn to lead the people into the fulfillment of God's promise. As the Israelites gathered before him, there was a sense of awe and reverence. The transition of leadership was not one to be taken lightly, but Joshua's heart was full of courage, and his faith in the Lord was unwavering. God had chosen him, and Joshua trusted that the same Lord who had been faithful to Moses would now lead him and the people into victory. The Lord spoke to Joshua, giving him clear instructions and encouragement, saying, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Joshua took these words to heart, and with that divine assurance, he led the people to the edge of the Jordan River, the final barrier between them and the land they had long awaited. As they crossed the river, God performed another miracle. The waters of the Jordan parted, just as the Red Sea had parted for Moses, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry ground. This miraculous event further solidified the people's faith in Joshua and in the power of the God who had led them this far. Their first major challenge came in the city of Jericho, a formidable fortress that stood as the first obstacle to their conquest of the Promised Land. The walls of Jericho were thick and impregnable, but Joshua, with his trust in God's instructions, did not waver. God commanded the people to march around the city once each day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing trumpets and the people shouting. When the 7th day came, the people did as instructed. They marched around Jericho, their faith in God's plan unwavering. Then, with the sound of trumpets and the loud shout of the people, the walls of Jericho crumbled, and the city fell. This victory was a testament to the power of God's presence and to Joshua's faithful leadership. As the Israelites continued their conquest, they moved from city to city, tribe by tribe, claiming the land that had been promised to their ancestors. They faced many battles and challenges, but with God on their side, they were victorious. The land of milk and honey, rich with promise, was now within their grasp. The journey that had begun with Moses' call at the burning bush had come full circle. The people of Israel, who had once been slaves in Egypt, were now free and settled in the land that had been promised to their forefathers. It was a land flowing with abundance, a land where they could build their homes, raise their families, and worship the Lord in peace. Though their journey had been long, fraught with trials and tribulations, the Israelites now understood the profound truth that had guided them every step of the way. The Lord had been with them. Through every trial, every victory, and every challenge, God's presence had never left them. He had been their protector, their provider, and their guide. And now, under Joshua's leadership, they had arrived at the Promised Land, ready to fulfill the purpose that God had set before them. Joshua's leadership was marked by faithfulness to God, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and an unwavering commitment to fulfilling the promises made to their ancestors. Under his guidance, the Israelites took possession of the land, and they began to build a new life, one rooted in the covenant with the Lord, knowing that He was with them always, just as He had promised. Chapter 15. The Legacy of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus is not just a historical account of a people liberated from the chains of slavery. It is a profound narrative of faith, resilience, and divine intervention, a story that resonates through the ages as a testament to God's unyielding love and faithfulness. It is the tale of a people who endured the unimaginable, from oppression to freedom, from wilderness to the promised inheritance. More than a physical journey, the Exodus was a spiritual odyssey, one that shaped the identity of the Israelites and left a legacy that would endure for generations. As the Israelites settled in the land promised to their ancestors, they began to reflect upon the journey they had taken. It was a journey marked by miraculous signs and wonders, a journey filled with moments of doubt, but also of unshakable faith. They remembered the powerful hand of God that had reached down to deliver them from Egypt, parting the Red Sea and making a way where there was no way. They remembered the manna that had fallen from heaven to feed them, the water from the rock that had quenched their thirst, and the cloud by day and the fire by night that had guided them through the wilderness. But perhaps most importantly, they remembered the covenant that had been made with their forefathers, a covenant that was now being fulfilled in their generation. The promise of a land flowing with milk and honey, a promise that had seemed so distant during their years of bondage, had now become a reality. And they knew, deep in their hearts, that this was not just a result of their own efforts or strength, but a fulfillment of God's word, spoken long before. The legacy of the Exodus was not just about the land they had inherited. It was about the relationship they had with their God. It was a relationship forged through trials, one that had been tested and proven in the furnace of adversity. It was a relationship that transcended the physical journey and entered into the spiritual realm, a covenant of trust, of obedience, and of devotion to the one true God. As the years passed, and the Israelites began to establish their lives in the Promised Land, the story of the Exodus was not forgotten. It became a central part of their identity, passed down from one generation to the next, a constant reminder of the God who had delivered them, the God who had walked with them through the wilderness, and the God who had given them the victory. It was a story that reinforced their faith, that reminded them of their calling as God's chosen people, and that inspired them to remain faithful to the covenant. The Exodus was more than a historical event. It was a living legacy. It was a story that shaped the values and beliefs of the Israelites, influencing their worship, their laws, and their way of life. The Passover, for example, became an annual celebration, a time to remember the night when the angel of death passed over the homes of the Israelites in Egypt, sparing them from the final plague. This act of deliverance was forever etched in their hearts, and each year, as they gathered to celebrate, they were reminded of the grace and mercy of God. Even as the Israelites settled into their new life in the Promised Land, the lessons of the Exodus continued to echo through their history. They were reminded that their freedom had come at a great cost, that the path to the land of promise had been long and filled with hardships, but that through it all, God had been with them, leading them, guiding them, and providing for them. The legacy of the Exodus was a legacy of faith, faith that persevered through doubt, faith that trusted in God's promises even when the road seemed impossible, and faith that led them to the fulfillment of God's word. It was a legacy of hope, a hope that no matter the trials they faced, God's faithfulness would never fail them. As the generations passed, the story of the Exodus continued to be told, a story that would inspire not only the Israelites, but countless others who would look to it as a beacon of hope. The journey of the Israelites was a journey of transformation, from slavery to freedom, from despair to hope, from wandering to settling in the land of promise. And through it all, the God who had called them out of Egypt remained their constant guide, their protector, and their faithful deliverer. The legacy of the Exodus is the legacy of God's faithfulness. It is a story of a people who trusted in the promise of God, and through that trust, they found freedom, purpose, and a place in the land of promise. It is a legacy that continues to inspire faith and hope in the hearts of all who hear it, reminding us that the God who led the Israelites out of Egypt is the same God who leads us today. Epilogue: The promise endures. The promise that began with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was fulfilled in the lives of the Israelites. But that promise, though realized in the land of Canaan, points to a greater fulfillment: the promise of salvation and redemption for all people through the coming of the Messiah. Just as Moses led the people out of slavery in Egypt, so too would Jesus, the true and greater Moses, lead all of humanity from the slavery of sin into the freedom of eternal life. And so, the journey continues, for the promise of God's faithfulness endures throughout the ages, guiding his people toward the fulfillment of his ultimate plan.